Author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
President Ronald Reagan once said that the scariest words in the English language were, "We're from the government and we're here to help." How right he was. It seems that statist intrusions into our everyday lives are continuing apace, whether it's by heavy-handed orders, creeping inflation, the mishandling of economic matters that eat into every single penny we earn. It all adds to a crushing weight on the back of regular Americans. And we have to ask, will this blunt quasi-authoritarianism fly at the ballot box? Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio American Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. We have a superb lineup for you today, including Joe Biden's decision to stop you buying your favorite light bulbs with Lisa K. Donna, the latest GDP figures with Andrew Moran, and have Russia and Ukraine cross the Rubicon with defense expert Dave Patterson, and the power of kings and presidents on our special Talking Liberty segment with Scott D. Cosenza, all coming right up. I want to take a moment to say a special thank you to our listeners out in Kankakee, Illinois on WKAN 1340 AM and 101.3 FM. Thank you for being here. And remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a great range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. And without further ado, let's jump right in and get started with this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio. The heavy hand of the state is ready to intercede in your life once again, and this time it's for every single room in the house. Is nowhere safe from the creeping tentacles of government busybodies? Well, helping shed some real incandescent light in this matter is Liberty Nation's editor-in-chief, Lisa K. Donna. Welcome back, Lisa.
Good to be here, Mark.
So, Lisa, Joe Biden has followed the Bush-Obama trajectory and decided to ban the incandescent light bulb. What's the motivation and how's he doing it?
Well, you know, Mark, this has been a long time coming. There was a battle, and Trump actually pushed back and stalled it for a while, just as he did on the shower head affair. But
proper showers for Americans. What a campaign slogan.
Yeah, exactly. And lights. And so now, either between 60 and 75 days, the Department of Energy says, boom, no more incandescent lights. I predict this is going to cause a real issue with the general populace, because up until 2020, that's the latest figures we have on it, 30% of people were still buying incandescent light. And that was, you know, having to hunt for them and search for them and go through, you know, couples of columns of Amazon and whatnot, internet searches for a regular incandescent light bulb. And why? Why are people searching for the incandescent, old-fashioned Thomas Edison, at least Americans say Thomas Edison, we can argue about that later, light bulb? You know, because they like it.
And why wouldn't they? The light quality is so much better. It feels nicer on the eyes. And as you point out in a recent column, Lisa, that you've written on this very subject, it's not just a light source in your home. It's an interior design of your home, how the light looks in your home. Lisa, will you be stocking up on the incandescent beauties?
Oh, I've already put a large order in. You know, and I think a lot of people are. Look, there's a couple of advantages. We know why they're doing this, because incandescent bulbs burn more energy. They don't last as long as LED lights. But there are so many positives to incandescent. First of all, they don't cast you blue or green. Second of all, you know, they can be mood setters. And there's plenty of psychological, behavioral studies out there that show that light affects mood. And, you know, putting everyone under the Klieg light of an LED, which, by the way, is not a panacea. I mean, plenty of LED lights go pop. And if one does in your chandelier, 9 times out of 10, your whole chandelier is shot.
Well, there's a couple of issues that people don't really know about LED bulbs. And this really brings us on to the point of who's going to be affected by this change in policy all the more, because yes, they produce less heat, therefore less, I guess it's pollution or less carbon dioxide heat waste. But that's only if they're not in a covered surround. So if, for example, you have some kind of lamp fixture or light fixture over the bulb, then they're not going to last as long anyway, because the heat just burns itself out.
Yeah, Americans are not going to be happy about this. I want to know, you're live in the UK. I believe you and one other author on Liberty Nation living, in Europe have lived under the gun of this ridiculous regulation for a while. What's that been like, Mark?
Well, I and yes, another writer on the staff are martyrs to the European Union, unfortunately, which brought in this regulation a few years back that stopped. Again, it's the same as in the US. It's not illegal to buy a bulb, but it's illegal for manufacturers to produce and sell them, which is what they're doing in the US here. And it's been terrible. It's just the light quality is poor. In my home here, I rarely use the overhead lights because they just feel bad on your body. They feel bad on your eyes. So we use salt lamps in pretty much every room just because that's a much nicer light to have. And it's a bit of a strain on the eyes, sure, but it's just a nicer feeling. And another thing you mentioned, if you're changing one bulb in your chandeliers, I don't know if everybody knows this, but many of the LED bulbs, they're not suitable for dimmable switches. So if you have a dimmable fixture, well, that's got to go, because otherwise you're going to end up with the flickering non-stop.
Oh, isn't that the truth? I've spent hours looking for the word dimmable online to find the right light bulbs to go with the fixture, dimmable LEDs, dimmable. And even then, let me just say that we got a dimmable LED, and 2 of the LEDs went out within a week.
Yeah, that's the reality of them. You've got to actually do some retrofitting. Now, this is the big thing, right? It's supposed to save householders up to $3 billion over a period of time. That's the selling point from Biden administration. But the reality is that for the Americans who can't afford to redo their entire lighting systems within their homes, this is going to be a major expense to actually just try and get light.
Well, and people have done studies. You know who it hurts the most? The lower income. Because when you go to the dollar store, you go to Dollar Tree, the light bulbs that are on sale are the incandescents, not the LEDs. The LEDs cost more. They just do. And, this is going to hurt low-income families, etc.
Yeah, I mean, there's a little bit of history on this, is that I believe it started under G.W. Bush in 2007. He tried to get it up and running by 2012 when Obama, the position got up and running by 2012, and then Obama, he pushed it as well. And then, obviously, when Donald Trump came into office, he put a halt on it. And now that Donald Trump's not in office anymore, Joe Biden's pushing on. Now, is it because G.W. Bush, Obama, and Joe Biden, do they care about the environment more? Or are they just more heavy-handed and statist and willing to use that weight of state on the American individual?
Well, they worship at the altar of the government. And I think Americans can be a contrary lot. They don't want somebody telling them what kind of shower head to use, what kind of light bulb to use, and there are real mental health issues when it comes to light bulbs, et cetera. Otherwise, you wouldn't have seasonal affective disorder. The issue, they've done studies that show full spectrum light, that is light that you get from the sun, right? All the colors in the rainbow is the healthiest. If you take the population and they only have access to 1 or 2 colors of light in LEDs, that could seriously affect the emotions and the mood and the tenor of the population.
Yeah,
I really believe that, and I think that's been set out.
It's absolutely right. There's a scientist, Andrew, I believe it's Andrew Huberman. He has a great YouTube show called the Huberman Lab, and he talks about how light impacts your sleep cycle. So when you get up in the morning, the best thing to do is to go outside straight away and get some light actually touching your eyes, get some sunlight touching your eyes. But if the main light source you're getting before you go to bed or when you wake up in the morning is that of an LED, that's actually going to impact how well you sleep when you get tired. And a lack of sleep, people don't talk about it a lot, but a lack of sleep, it's basically one of the prime drivers of suicide, because people can't have that rest to sort their brains out.
It's also the prime driver of weight gain. Anyone will tell you that, and that's not healthy. I just think all the way around, worshiping at the altar of the green climate change movement is causing us problems in big and little ways. And the only two words I have about this whole light bulb fiasco is stock up.
Stock up indeed. Lisa K. Donna, thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Mark.
Further on down the line, we examine Joe Biden and the power of kings in our special Talking Liberty segment. But up next, after this short break, what on earth happened to American GDP? Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Well, the latest GDP first quarter figures are out for the United States, and it doesn't look so great. But fortunately, we're joined by Liberty Nation's economics affairs correspondent and guru on all things economics, Mr. Andrew Moran, to help us see what works and what doesn't in this new Bidenomics economy. Welcome back to the show, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
So tell me, what's the latest GDP figures?
Yeah, so this was astounding because everyone expected at the bare minimum an expansion in the GDP of around the Atlanta Fed Bank had it penciled in at 0.4%. This number that came out on the morning of April 28th, negative 1.4%. This is the first contraction of the economy since the second quarter of 2020, and it took everyone by surprise. I think the number I saw of the 70 analysts that provided their projections, only 5 of them expected a decline.
What's interesting there is you say from the third quarter of 2020, that was in the peak of the pandemic.
Yes.
And so we expect a contraction in GDP for that period. But now we're out of the pandemic. The restrictions have been lifted and we've still got a contraction. Does that mean that the economy is essentially an utter mess?
Well, there are many factors when it comes to the GDP report that showed why it fell. So one of the big things that all the mainstream media outlets are focusing on is that business inventory accumulation actually contracted during this period. If you read one of my articles earlier this year on Liberty Nation, I talked about the reason why the fourth quarter growth was the best since 1984 was because of business inventory accumulations. A lot of companies were stocking ahead of the holiday season, so you had dramatic growth. Now, fast forward a quarter, and as I expected, these numbers were going to decline, and that's what contributed to the recessionary GDP in the first quarter. Other things too, federal, state, and local government spending declined. That took a dip. Exports, that also took a huge significant decline in the GDP snapshot. The only things that were up were imports and non-residential investment activity. Those are the two things that
foreigners buying land and replacing the things that America's stopped building itself. Those are the two growth areas.
That's correct.
Well, that seems a shame in and of itself. Now, Andrew, we obviously during the fourth quarter of last year, we had a lot of media talking heads, a lot of people in the administration saying how well the Biden economy is doing and crediting Joe Biden with that. But as you say, it was really just inflated because of supply chain crises beforehand. And of course, people not being able to shop. So they built inventories in the shop. So that was a false picture then. Yeah. And yet the Biden administration took full credit for it. So do you see them taking full credit for a negative 1.4 shrinkage with the same gusto?
Oh, no, I expect, just like inflation, it was Putin's price hike. I guarantee you in the coming weeks or heading into the midterms, it's going to be Putin's recession if the second quarter also has a negative reading of the GDP. And what's interesting, too, is that before the GDP came out, the White House, they always do this now before every major economic report that shows, that shows an abysmal snapshot of the economy. So, 2 officials said, oh, well, this is only because of a specific thing in the economy, that overall the economy is doing very well. But you can't really buy into that because, first of all, yes, consumer spending in that GDP number was higher. But why was it higher? Because people had to spend more because of higher inflation. The personal savings rate also dipped 1%. Why is that? Because more people are eating into their pent-up savings to help cover this cost of living crisis. And the supply chain snafus, I mean, that's not improving anytime soon either. You still have the backlogs. You have the high traffic volumes in the coast of China and in the coast of the west coast of the United States. So overall, there's so many factors factors adding to this. And one more thing too, this GDP report does not include the Federal Reserve raising interest rates, especially how more aggressive it's going to be in the coming months. So I expect the second quarter GDP probably to not be it could be worse than this one, just because the supply chain crisis is not getting better because China was under lockdown. Shanghai closed up shop. Factories had to stop producing, and now they're having catch up. But that's not as good either. But I won't go into that part. And then, of course, the Fed, they're trimming their balance sheet, the $9 trillion balance sheet, and they're raising interest rates by 50 basis points at the May and June likely FOMC policy meetings. And one more thing too,
Andrew, I've got to cut you off there. Let's dig down a bit into this, because you've rattled off a lot of numbers there and a lot of approaches towards handling the economy to try and steer it away from what the Biden administration calls the Putin price cycle, Putin inflationary measures. But we heard Chuck Schumer, the majority Senate leader, the other day say that the way to get out of this inflationary mess was to raise taxes. What's your analysis on that?
But see, no, that's not the way. It's not the way to do it. Here's how you trim inflation. You stop printing money. You cut federal spending, and there you go. That's how you can help lower inflation.
So, Andrew, you've said a lot of naughty words today, like the federal government cutting back on spending. My goodness, you're going to put people into paroxysms here. Now, I also heard you mention another dirty word at least twice so far during this chat, and that's the R word, the recession word. Now, a lot of people will be saying that this is not a technical recession that we're headed towards. There's not a recession that we're headed towards. And we're also going to hear people calling out that we are headed full steam ahead to a recession. Now, could you just give us the technical indicators of a recession?
Well, the main definition of a recession is 2 straight quarters of negative growth. So if the second quarter shows, let's say, negative 0.9%, that's a technical recession. So the U.S. would be in a recession. If you look at a lot of market analysts say, I mean, the big thing is that stagflation is the more likely outcome. And then when we talk to other analysts, as I've done in recent weeks, they call it a growth recession, whereby, there would be growth, but it wouldn't match long-term averages of at least 1.5%.
You and I have talked about this word, growth recession, before, Andrew. It's similar to empty calories, as in it's almost an oxymoron in itself. Could you give us a little more detail on a growth recession? Because we are going to be hearing that term a huge amount, because it's a lot nicer than just saying we're in a recession.
Well, it's funny. I've been writing about economics for a decade, and I studied at Mises Institute economics, and I've never heard that term before, growth recession. But it's from what I've learned from this market analyst is that a growth recession is when the economy grows below the long-term average of 1.5%. Now that happened a lot under the Obama years. I never heard that term either.
Well, I'm sure the government will find a way to spend their way out of it with your money. Andrew Moran, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio, heard across the Radio America network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. And remember, you can tune in for Liberty Nation on KNTR 106.3 FM out of Lake Havasu City, Arizona. Later on the show, we discuss the power of presidents and kings in talking liberty. But up next, we ask if Russia and Ukraine have crossed their own personal Rubicons. Don't touch that dial. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
As the war between Russia and Ukraine continues, it seems that both sides are on the brink of crossing their very own personal Rubicons. Now, what does this mean in practice, and where does it leave the United States? To help us figure out the facts, we're joined once again by former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Controller, Dave Patterson. Thanks for being here, Dave.
Thank you, Mark. Happy to be with you.
So, Dave, Russia has recently cut off gas supplies to Poland and Bulgaria. Now, is this a final step or a first step for the Kremlin? And what kind of response do we predict from this move?
Well, I think it by virtue of chronology, it's one of the first steps that they've taken to respond to the amount of support that has been flowing into to Ukraine. I think that should have been expected. I mean, when you consider the fact that most of the world is lined up against Russia, 40 countries participated yesterday or the day before in in meetings to determine whether or not they would and how much they would provide in terms of support, both financial, humanitarian, and military. So the world is kind of lining up on one side, and Russia is kind of out of options in terms of exerting pressure. And the cutting off of the gas to Poland and Bulgaria is probably a step of desperation in terms of showing their position in the world.
Well, it seems to me that the only thing stopping the further escalation by the West is that Putin, specifically for Europe, I mean here, that Putin could literally just cut off the energy supplies to the entire of the European Union area. And now that he's done it to at least two countries, is there anything really holding the Western alliance back from
I think that
new levels of sanctions, etc.?
No, I mean, there never actually was. I mean, it was just a figment of their imagination that they were somewhat conservative in how they were approaching Russia. But consider this, that the EU has drawn up a draft of what they were going to do anyway by banning Russian oil products. So this isn't a surprise to them. And Bulgaria and Poland have said publicly that they have a significant amount of storage of fuel and liquefied natural gas, and currently it's not a problem for them. There are plenty of options that are available. The United States, of course, has a significant amount of liquid natural gas that they can provide,
but that's only once the infrastructure is in place, isn't that right? 'Cause there isn't a pipeline as such for now.
No, but there are numerous tanker ships that obviously, and vessels that can be put in train to carry the gas to Europe.
Now, if America has these supplies, which clearly she does, why is there an energy crisis in the US?
Well, that's purely a function of the Biden energy policies that he has, by default or simply neglect, not decided that the United States would be energy independent as it was under President Trump. And consequently, when you're beholden to other countries for your energy, then you look as though you're energy deficient.
Yeah, you and I spoke briefly about this before, didn't we? When Donald Trump had actually offered Europe supplies of liquefied natural gas, and for whatever reasons they turned it down. Are they looking back on that decision as somewhat of a faux pas now?
I think in the private councils they certainly are, and because they wouldn't be in this position if they had taken President Trump up on that offer. And consider the fact that once again that a number of things have started to combine to make this cutting off of the natural gas not as big a deal, and that is that first of all it's spring and heating oil and natural gas for home use is down anyway, and as you go into the summer for heating it will be negligible. Obviously for air conditioning and electricity production it will be important, but
as Game of Thrones warns us though, winter is coming.
Winter is coming. That's exactly right. But one would hope that this war in the Ukraine would have resolved by next winter.
Hopefully, yeah. Now let's look at this from the Ukrainian side briefly, Dave. President Zelensky recently said that Russia can't be trusted with nuclear capabilities. Now I can see where he's coming from. To some extent, he wants future protection. But is this kind of talk likely to further escalate tensions? I mean, from a practical standpoint, how would anybody in the world even go about disarming Russia? And we saw, obviously, Ukraine had nuclear weapons and then gave them up, and look where they are now.
Yes, you've kind of put on the table several different things. First of all, Zelensky's right. Russia cannot be trusted. Secondly, the fact that he wants Russia to give up nuclear weapons, that won't happen. And the third thing that you raised is, yes, the Ukraine was duped back in the early 90s.
94, I believe, yeah.
Yes, 94 at the Budapest conference. And when the Western world said, if you'll give up your nuclear weapons that you have the largest stockpile of right now, we will provide you and we will support and guarantee your sovereignty. So if you wanted to look at trust, Russia did sign that document and supported it. The Clinton administration at that time supported it. Subsequently, I would say that no one has supported that, obviously, except for the fact that a great deal of aid is going to Ukraine.
Okay, now, so both sides, they've significantly ramped up their actions and or rhetoric. Now, what's America prepared to do you think? And what should America be prepared to do, in your opinion?
Well, I think there are two things. First of all, the United States needs to believe people when they write documents and when they speak publicly. Sergei Lavrov just 2 days ago said that it looks as though tactical nuclear weapons become an option for Russia. Believe them when they say that. And so as a consequence, steps should be taken in the United States and elsewhere among the nuclear nations to at least be ready for such a horrible event. But you can't be sitting there saying, oh, we had no idea this was going to happen, because you have an idea that this might happen. And so the next thing, I think, and this is probably somewhat controversial, but as soon as this dies down, the United States and NATO particularly should request the opportunity to have temporary forces in Moldova and Georgia, and to let Putin know that you're not going to do this again with former Warsaw Bloc nations.
Well, the not being prepared based on what people have said seems to be a hallmark of the Biden administration, from what I can see. Dave Patterson, thank you ever so much for being here.
Hey, thank you, Mark.
And the best is still yet to come. After this short break, we're talking liberty with Scott D. Cassandra, examining the power of kings and the wannabe dictators. We'll be right back. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
If you've been wanting the inside scoop on what's happening in the legal realm, well, you've come to the right place. From presidential pardons to the Supreme Court, we have it all. And to help us navigate the murky waters of the swamp, we're once again joined by Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor and host of the most excellent Uprising podcast, Mr. Scott D. Cassandra, Esquire. Welcome back to the show, Scott.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's great to be here.
So the first thing I want to talk about is presidential pardons and commutations. What's happened?
Well, President Biden has for the first time used his presidential powers of pardon and commutation. He pardoned 3 people. One who was accused of selling a dossier, I think, a Secret Service dossier. And he was like the first black guy who was ever on the presidential protection detail. And there was some evidence in the record to indicate that some jealousy and racial animosity is why he was charged in the first place. And 2 others who were nonviolent drug offenders. And then he commuted the sentences of dozens of others who were mostly nonviolent drug users.
Now, here's something that really struck me with this. Joe Biden has often credited himself, as have the media, with guiding the 1994 crime bill through the Senate, which sought harsher punishments for drug possession. So,
well, to be clear, Mark, he was more about claiming credit for that when it was to his political benefit to be tough on crime. In recent years, he has shied away from demanding such authorship credit.
Success of many fathers and failure is an orphan.
Right.
So the people who have received commutations, nonviolent drug offenders, is it fair to say that many nonviolent drug offenders probably wouldn't be still in prison or having such heavy records if Joe Biden hadn't been involved or hadn't pushed
One of the
crime
one of
bill?
the persons he pardoned, Mark, as I read her record, I recoiled because I think it was 8 years in prison she did for a first time crack offense. And that disparity in federal law between powdered cocaine and crack cocaine, which animates so much of the criticism against these things, was, put into place by by Sleepy Joe himself. So
By then Senator, then Vice President, now President Joe Biden.
yeah,
So is it fair to say that really he's just cleaning up his own mess?
he locks them up and then he lets them out, I guess.
Well, this seems to be the Democratic Party principle, although they are trying to avoid the initial part of that equation at the moment.
Yeah.
There's another
the thing is about the pardon power. Our founders
it's the power of
put
a
it
king,
into-
Scott, isn't it? It's the power of a king.
Our founders put it into the Constitution for a reason. This isn't some wildly new idea by some legal theorist. Like, they knew that the system would, and this is before we had this wild body of everything being a federal crime, right? This is way back when it was just treason, piracy, and counterfeiting, I think, were the 3 federal crimes. The idea that there would need to be this pressure relief valve and that it should be exercised by the executive goes back to the founding, and it's a good idea when the president uses it.
Yeah, I'd say that this being the first round of pardons and commutations, there are obviously likely more to come during his presidency. But I think it's fair to say that this round was possibly the least controversial that we've had in recent years.
It doesn't seem to be sparking much in the way of controversy, and that's a good thing. It should be used regularly without controversy rather than what I think we've seen from both Democrat and Republican administrations in the past, which is used more infrequently and with controversy.
Yeah, often with the 11th hour before leaving office, getting those favors in. So So the mask mandates for public transport that was initially booted by a federal judge in Florida last week has now been challenged by the DOJ at the request of the CDC, both of which I think we should point out are under the jurisdiction of the Biden administration. Scott, what's happening?
Yeah, well, there's a distinction without a difference there when it comes to the decision making, right? It's Biden. These are political decisions. The only thing I think that's particularly interesting about this, Mark, is that the CDC has not asked for, through the Justice Department, has not asked for an injunction of the lower court order. The district court judge ruled, and what would be very common in this kind of litigation would be that they go to the appellate court and say, stay this decision while we fight about it. And they haven't asked for that. And so it's curious because if the mandate is important, in fact, if it's vital enough to impose on the American people, why isn't it important enough to ask for an injunction of the lower court order that vacates the mandate, right? Well, no administration official has answered that question that I know of to date.
Could it be that they're wanting to put the impression out that they are willing to fight for the mandate, but are aware that they're probably going to lose anyway?
What I think it's more about is they want a ruling from a higher court that they were right in the first place in their exercise of power, because one thing that the branches often fight about is their power. And they wish to, they don't want to cede any ground in that area. And so while the mandate may be not useful politically for them at this point, the ability to impose other mandates, they don't want to give that up on the legal front. And so I think that's probably why.
Well, that's actually quite an interesting point, because Dr. Anthony Fauci recently said in response to this, he said that these decisions shouldn't be left to court judges.
Courts, absolutely not. No.
The courts shouldn't be there to determine the laws that are applied to
competent health officials like Dr. Fauci, who are above reproach on these matters, are the ones who should, by fiat, be able to direct all of the Americans.
Let's delve into this a little bit, Scott, because for me, I found this just utterly shocking that he would suggest that decisions that impact the lives of so many people shouldn't be subject to judicial review. So could you go into it a little bit for us?
Dr. Fauci's madness?
Let's call it his reasoning.
I don't know that there was any reasoning presented, except for that he thought that his opinions and on how people should live their lives should be given preeminence in law rather than our lawful system of justice, which indicates that judges are capable of ruling on executive actions to determine their validity.
It reminds me of the pretty much every communist country that's existed that decides to appoint a board of central planners who make the decisions, and whatever needs to be legal becomes legal because the central planners choose it. And of course, that way, as we've seen in every instance, lies famine and shortages. Your thoughts,
Yes,
Scott?
it does. We know for sure that is the result every single time.
And the final topic I want to cover, Scott, just very briefly, is another president. That's President Donald Trump, who's recently been ordered in a contempt of court charge to pay 10,000 smackaroos a day until he complies with producing documents to New York Attorney General Letitia James. What's going on?
Well, what's going on is that Donald Trump doesn't like to comply with subpoenas that he doesn't like to comply with, and I guess he's wealthy enough that if it costs him $10K a day for some significant delay, then maybe that's a cost worth doing business for him. He may also hope to have that award reduced on appeal or something like that, but I wouldn't tempt that fate if it were for my pocketbook on the line.
Yeah, it seems to me that Letitia James is involved in just about every piece of litigation against Donald Trump that's been happening. And yet, so far, she's come up empty after 4 or 5 years. What's going on?
Well, what's going on is that she's working her damnedest to do everything she can to produce a criminal charge against Donald Trump. This is the work of a number of district attorneys, like Carl Racine was in D.C., where they just, instead of trying to do the best they can for the people in their state. I'm sure there are all kinds of sort of consumer ripoffs going on in New York, whether it's car warranty work or some other thing, right, that we all are sort of beset by, that Ms. James could turn our attention to. But whether it's the NRA or Donald Trump, she uses her office to dunk on Republicans and make hay for Democrats. To be fair, Mark, she did campaign on those issues as well. So it's not like she's done a 180 when she took in office. She announced that she would corrupt the office when she got into it, and she has corrupted the office while she was there. So promise kept from New York's Attorney General, I think, on that count.
A rare promise, no matter how poisonous. Scott D. Cosenza, thank you ever so much.
Cheers, Mark. Thank you.
And that just about wraps it up for this week on Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I want to thank our guests, Lisa K. Donner, Andrew Moran, Dave Patterson, and Scott D. Cosenza. And of course, my sincerest thanks to you, the listeners, for joining us each and every week. You're always appreciated. My final thoughts for this episode. When it feels like the very fabric of the world is on the brink of tearing, when we look on aghast at the corruption and ineptitude of the swollen government that seemingly fails at every turn, it's worth remembering the words of Sigmund Freud, who said, quote, "One day, in retrospect, the years of struggle will strike you as the most beautiful," end quote. For it's fire that tempers steel. It is the crushing weight that turns coal into diamonds. It's the hardships in life that make us stronger. Don't look upon the present burden as something that will crush your will, but rather as something that is making you stronger and even more formidable. And you may well look back on these days with gratitude for the strength these trials have given you. If we can each see ourselves in the future as something greater than the tribulations we have faced, then we are not in the present to be despondent, but rather joyous that we have been given the opportunity to make excellence within ourselves. And that's a goal worth achieving. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
We're doing it for real, really real. Liberty Nation.
And Jeff Charles, contributor for
I think
LibertyNation.com.
we're starting to make an impact. Liberty style, fight for freedom.
The tracking poll sponsored by Liberty Nation for Thursday.
Mentioned by Dan Bongino, Rasmussen, Jordan Peterson, and
I
others.
can do it again if you want me to.
Cited in Mark Levin's American Marxism.
I think we're starting to make a really big impact. Get noticed. We're doing it. Rock on. I'm gone.